It was a cold October night, the kind where the air bites at your skin and the darkness feels heavier than usual. Sarah was driving back from her late-night shift at the diner. The highway stretched out before her like a black ribbon under the faint glow of her headlights. The road was deserted, flanked by dense woods on either side. The only sounds were the hum of her car engine and the occasional chirp of crickets. About halfway through her usual route, she spotted something ahead, a figure walking along the shoulder of the road. At first, she thought it was a trick of her tired eyes. But as she approached, it became clear. A man, tall and gaunt, wearing a dark trench coat and a wide-brimmed hat. His head was tilted downward, his face obscured by shadows. Against her better judgment, Sarah slowed down as she passed, curiosity getting the better of her. He didn't look up, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge her presence at all. Something about him made her skin crawl, but she shook it off. People walked the highway sometimes, though rarely this late. She hit the gas and drove on, glancing in her rearview mirror. The man had stopped walking and stood perfectly still, his figure shrinking into the distance. A few miles later, Sarah saw him again. This time he was standing on the edge of the road, facing her car as it approached. Her heart pounded as she passed him, her hands tightening on the wheel. It wasn't possible. There was no way he could have gotten there ahead of her. She didn't stop to think about it, pushing her car faster down the empty highway. The radio crackled with static, cutting into the low hum of a country song she wasn't really listening to. She switched it off, but the unease growing in her chest only worsened. The man's image stuck in her mind. The long coat, the hat, the way he stood so unnaturally still. She kept driving, forcing herself to focus on the road. Then her headlights caught him again. He was standing dead center in the road this time, his arms hanging limply at his sides. She slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement. Her car came to a stop mere feet from the man. He didn't flinch, didn't move, just stood there. Sarah honked the horn, the sound blaring through the silent night. "Move," she yelled, though the windows were closed. The man slowly tilted his head, just enough that she could see part of his face. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes, dark and sunken, bore into her like twin voids. He smiled then, a thin, unnatural curve of his lips that sent ice through her veins. Panicked, Sarah threw the car into reverse, but before she could back away, the man was suddenly at her window. He didn't walk, he was just there, his face inches from the glass. His eyes were even darker up close, endless pits that seemed to draw the light out of the air. His lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear, couldn't understand. She screamed and hit the gas, swerving around him and speeding down the highway. Her hands trembled on the wheel, and her breaths came in ragged gasps. She didn't dare look back, not even in the mirror. All she wanted was to get home, to put as much distance as possible between her and whatever that was. When she finally pulled into her driveway, she was shaking so badly she could barely get the key into the door. She locked it behind her and collapsed on the couch, trying to calm her racing heart. Hours passed before she felt safe enough to go to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, she found muddy footprints leading from the front door to her bedroom window. They stopped abruptly, as if whoever or whatever had been standing there had simply vanished. She never drove that highway at night again. But sometimes, late at night, when the house was silent and the world seemed still, she swore she could hear footsteps outside her window.
Story number 2.
It was nearly midnight when David locked up the small convenience store where he worked. The streets were deserted, the flickering neon signs of nearby shops casting eerie shadows on the cracked pavement. The walk to his apartment was only a few blocks, but tonight the air felt heavy, oppressive. He pulled his jacket tighter and started down the dimly lit street. As he passed a narrow alleyway, a sound stopped him dead in his tracks, a faint, wet squelch like something being dragged through mud. His breath hitched as he turned his head toward the alley. There was nothing visible, just darkness stretching into the unknown. He told himself it was just his imagination, that it was nothing more than an animal or a leaking pipe. But as he stepped forward, the sound came again, louder this time. A shiver ran down his spine. David quickened his pace, his footsteps echoing unnervingly in the empty street. The sound from the alley didn't fade. It followed him, growing louder and closer with every step. He dared a glance over his shoulder and froze. At the mouth of the alley, something was emerging, slowly, deliberately. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. It moved in jerky, unnatural motions as though it didn't quite understand how to walk. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a featureless expanse of pale, glistening flesh. In its bony hands, it dragged something behind it, a dark, unidentifiable mass that left a slick trail on the ground. David's instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. The thing tilted its head in his direction, and though it had no eyes, David knew it was looking right at him. His paralysis broke, and he bolted. He sprinted down the street, his heart pounding like a drum. He could hear it behind him, the squelching sound of the thing dragging its burden, growing faster, louder. It wasn't just following him, it was chasing him. His lungs burned as he pushed himself harder, turning down another street and into an older part of the neighborhood. The streetlights here were dim, some completely out, casting long, jagged shadows. He darted into an abandoned lot, hoping to lose it in the maze of debris and overgrown weeds. He crouched behind a rusted dumpster, trying to quiet his ragged breathing. The sound of dragging stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the air. It was close, too close. Peeking out from his hiding spot, David's blood turned to ice. The thing was standing in the middle of the lot, its head swiveling unnaturally as if sniffing the air. Then slowly, it lifted a hand and pointed directly at him. Before he could even think, it let out a sound, a piercing, unearthly screech that made his ears ring and his vision blur. David scrambled out from his hiding spot and ran again, weaving through the lot and back onto the streets. His apartment was only a block away now, and he could see the faint light of his window. He didn't look back, didn't dare check if it was still behind him. He slammed through the front door of his building, racing up the stairs 2 at a time. Once inside his apartment, he locked the door, bolted it, and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. He collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, his whole body trembling. For several minutes, there was only silence. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost polite, but insistent. David stared at the door, his heart hammering in his chest. The knock came again, louder this time. He backed away, grabbing the nearest thing he could find, a heavy lamp, and holding it like a weapon. The knocking stopped, replaced by that same wet, squelching sound. A shadow passed under the door, and then the thing began to speak. Its voice was wrong, too many layers, too many pitches, all distorted like a broken radio. "David," it said, dragging out his name, savoring it. "You can't hide." He clamped his hands over his ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was inside his head now, echoing and growing louder. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the door splintering open and the thing stepping inside. David's neighbors found his apartment the next day. The door hung open, broken from the inside. The place was in shambles, furniture overturned, the walls scratched and marked with deep gouges, but David was gone. The only trace of him was a dark, wet trail leading from his apartment to the alleyway outside. And the dragging sound, it never stopped.
Story number 3.
Lila had always enjoyed walking home from her university's library late at night. The quiet streets, the cool air, and the occasional rustle of leaves made it feel like the world belonged only to her. But this night felt different. The usual tranquility was replaced by an oppressive silence, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Her route home took her past an old, abandoned house that everyone in town avoided. The house was a relic of another era, its once pristine Victorian exterior now sagging and covered in ivy. The windows, dark and cracked, stared out like empty eyes. Rumors about the house were as old as it was. Stories of disappearances, strange noises, and ghostly figures in the windows. Lila never believed in such things. It was just a house. As she approached, her footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the pavement. She glanced at the house, the hair on her arms rising. There was a light in one of the upstairs windows. It was faint, flickering like a candle, but it was unmistakable. She stopped, staring up at it. No one lived there. It was condemned years ago. She told herself it was just a trick of the light or her tired eyes playing games. Then the light went out. She quickened her pace, determined to put the house behind her. But as she passed, she heard it, a faint tapping, like nails on glass. She froze, her heart pounding. Slowly, she turned her head toward the house. In the window where the light had been, a figure stood silhouetted against the darkness. It was tall and impossibly thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Lila's breath caught in her throat as the figure raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. Long, spindly fingers splayed out, leaving smudges on the pane. Then it tapped again, deliberately, as if trying to get her attention. She couldn't move, couldn't look away. The figure tilted its head further, almost parallel to its shoulders, and then it smiled. The smile wasn't right. It stretched far too wide, revealing teeth that were sharp and jagged. The figure lifted a hand and beckoned her with a slow, deliberate motion. Lila's legs finally obeyed her frantic mind, and she ran. She didn't stop until she was safely inside her apartment, the door bolted and all the lights turned on. For days, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At first, she convinced herself it was paranoia. But then the tapping started. It was faint at first, just a few times a night, always at her bedroom window. She lived on the 3rd floor. The first time she heard it, she told herself it was the wind, maybe a branch brushing against the glass. But there were no trees near her window. The second night, it came again, louder, more insistent. She didn't look. She couldn't. She just buried herself under the covers, praying for it to stop. On the 3rd night, the tapping was accompanied by a low whisper. "Lila," it crooned, the voice distorted and echoing, as though coming from deep within a cave. "Let me in." Her blood ran cold. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, hoping it would go away. But the voice continued, growing louder, more guttural. "Lila, don't you want to see me?" She finally gathered the courage to glance at the window. Her heart nearly stopped. The figure from the abandoned house was there, its face pressed against the glass, that impossibly wide smile still etched into its features. It tapped again, harder this time, the sound echoing through the room. And then it spoke again. "You didn't say goodbye." The glass began to crack under its touch, spiderwebbing out from where its fingers pressed. Lila screamed, grabbing her phone and bolting from the apartment. She didn't stop running until she reached a friend's house on the other side of town. She spent the night there, refusing to sleep, and by morning, she convinced herself it had been a nightmare. When she returned to her apartment later that day, the window was intact. There was no sign of cracks, no smudges, no evidence that anything had happened. But on her bed was a single scrap of paper. Written in shaky, jagged handwriting were 3 words, "You looked anyway." She moved out the next week, but no matter where she went, she always felt it. The tapping never truly stopped.
Story number 4.
The night was cold, and the fog rolled in thick and low, swallowing up the narrow country road that Rachel had taken as a shortcut to her grandparents' farmhouse. Her GPS had warned her the route was unmapped, but she was in a hurry, and it was supposed to save 20 minutes. She regretted it now. The road was winding and seemed endless, with no sign of the farmhouse or any other landmarks. As she drove deeper into the fog, her headlights struggled to cut through the dense white haze. The trees on either side loomed like skeletal sentinels, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. Rachel turned the radio off. The static was grating, and the silence, though unsettling, was better. That's when she saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. She slammed on the brakes, her car screeching to a halt. It was a man, dressed in dark clothing, his head tilted downward so she couldn't see his face. His stance was odd, his shoulders hunched, arms dangling at his sides like a marionette with cut strings. "Are you kidding me?" Rachel muttered, her heart racing. She honked the horn, but the man didn't flinch. The longer she stared, the more wrong he seemed, like his limbs were just slightly too long, his posture just slightly off. Cautiously, she rolled down her window an inch and called out, "Hey, do you need help?" The man slowly lifted his head, and Rachel wished she hadn't spoken. His face was pale, his features distorted, as though someone had tried to sculpt a human face out of wet clay but hadn't quite finished. His eyes were dark hollows, empty and endless. Rachel panicked. She threw the car into reverse, but as she did, the man moved. Not walked, moved. One moment he was in front of her car, The next, he was at her window, his face inches from the glass. She screamed and floored the gas, swerving around him. The car jolted as her tires clipped something, but she didn't stop to look. Her heart pounded as she sped down the road, the fog growing thicker. She glanced in her rearview mirror, but the road was empty. For a moment, she thought she was safe. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement in the passenger seat. She turned her head and nearly lost control of the car. The man was sitting there, his head tilted toward her, his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. "You shouldn't have stopped," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. Rachel swerved, the car veering off the road and into a ditch. Her head hit the steering wheel, and everything went black. When she came to, the car was empty, the passenger door wide open. She stumbled out, the fog curling around her like a living thing. Her phone was smashed, and the road was silent, devoid of any other vehicles. She started walking, her footsteps crunching on the gravel. Every so often, she heard another set of footsteps behind her, slow, deliberate. She stopped and turned, but no one was there. She walked faster, the footsteps keeping pace. Then she started running. The footsteps turned into a sprint. She didn't dare look back. The farmhouse had to be close. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice calling her name, telling her she was safe, but it sounded wrong, like it was coming from the fog itself. Finally, she saw the faint outline of the house and bolted toward it. She pounded on the door, screaming for her grandparents. The door creaked open, but the house was dark, the air inside cold and still. "Grandma? Grandpa?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no answer. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The silence was deafening. She turned on the lights, but they flickered weakly before going out entirely. That's when she saw the muddy footprints. They led from the front door to the living room, where a figure sat in her grandfather's armchair. It was the man, his hollow eyes fixed on her, that same awful grin stretching across his face. "You shouldn't have stopped," he whispered again, his voice echoing unnaturally. The last thing Rachel saw before the lights went out for good was him rising from the chair, his limbs unfolding like a spider. Rachel was never found. Her car was discovered abandoned in the ditch, but no footprints led away from it. Her grandparents, when questioned, claimed they hadn't seen her in months. But in the weeks that followed, travelers on the same foggy road began reporting a figure standing in their path, a figure with a distorted face and hollow eyes, waiting for someone to stop.